All right, it's the most wonderful time of the year, draft day. Coming up tomorrow. I don't know about you, but I look forward to this with all my heart every year. I make blueberry muffins and I make a whole thing out of it, so that's a tradition. So I want to look through the position groups and talk about where I think Bean is most likely to strike. I do think Brandon Bean approaches drafts um, really from a long-term future looking perspective with just an eye on the present. So I really don't think what we perceive as immediate needs are what drive his draft decisions. I'll discuss all of the position groups, even those that are kind of obvious that we wouldn't address, just to get a good handle on where the roster sits right now. So quarterback, obviously Josh is there and he'll be there indefinitely, which is a great thing. Backup, you have Case Keenum on a 1-year deal, which is a really good backup situation, and Bean seems to be content to bring in another veteran each year on a 1-year deal. Then also you have Matt Barkley back, great locker room guy. I would expect we'll probably roster 2 quarterbacks, and Barkley will probably be cut at the end of training camp and then back on the practice squad would be my guess. I would be shocked if the Bills bring in another arm because there's nowhere to put him on the roster or really the practice squad. You never see a practice squad with 2 quarterbacks. Fullback, obviously you've got Reggie Gilliam. That's not going to change. He's analytically one of the better fullbacks in the game, so there's no need for an addition there. Maybe they'll bring in someone like a UDFA for a practice squad position or something like that, but you don't typically see fullbacks on practice squads. Running back. Now, this one is interesting because one of the most common mock draft scenarios for the Bills in round 1 at pick 25 is Breece Hall. And Breece Hall is probably the consensus number 1 pick in the number 1 back in the draft. But I think that if you really look closely at the running back room, it gets awkward if you bring in a premier back, someone who would be considered, a top pick, someone who's supposed to come in and play the predominant, the lion's share of the snaps. Because if you look at it, Singletary has a year left on his deal. He's played very well. Maybe leaves something to be desired in terms of explosion, but his shiftiness and the way he finds creases and somehow keeps the play alive, it's kind of uncanny. And I think we were all saying to each other last year, towards the end of the year, that he looks like RB1. And if he's RB1, that's great. I don't really see it as a big need position, and I see it as a position that is really difficult to upgrade. Because Singletary, if you look at statistically, he's near the top of the league since he's been in the league. And then you have Zach Moss still as a backup with 2 years left on his deal. And then you have Duke Johnson, who you brought in as a third down pass catching option. I don't see him going anywhere because he was brought in as kind of the fallback plan when the J.D. McKissick thing happened with Washington. So I really think, because Brandon Bean doesn't like to get rid of his draft picks. He's really loyal to his draft picks, you could say to a fault, and he doesn't like to cut draft picks of any substantial value. So yeah, he's cut some late round guys just out of necessity because there's not space on the roster. But if you bring in a Breece Hall or anyone near that value, what happens? You're not going to have Breece Hall, Devin Singletary, Zach Moss, and Duke Johnson on the roster at the same time. It's just not going to happen because you have Tywan Jones as well. He's there as the gunner. He's an elite special teams player. He's going to be on the roster. So what are you doing? It's hard for me to envision 3 drafted running backs on the roster at the same time. So could they bring one in? Sure. Would it make things awkward in the room? Absolutely. I think the only way they bring one in is if they're also at the same time moving one in a trade. That's how I would see it. So maybe not necessarily how Bean sees it, but if I were in his shoes, that's how I would be looking at it. And by the way, I don't think the Bills have given up on Zach Moss. They benched him after he couldn't find the hole by the end zone at the Monday night game against the Patriots. And then he really never played again the rest of the season. But he's in there at OTAs. He looks nasty in a good way. And I just think, 2 years left on his deal. I think there's still some belief there. And I'd really be surprised to see them move on from Singletary or Moss, which makes me question if they're keeping both Singletary and Moss, how is there really room for someone else? So we'll see. We'll put running back down as a maybe. Wide receiver. So this is an area that, a lot of people want to see a receiver added. I don't necessarily disagree, but I do question where exactly the playing time is where the receiver is going to find playing time. Because first of all, you've got rumors that Ken Dorsey's going to kind of switch the offense around a little bit, use a little bit more 12 personnel, 2 tight ends. And if he's doing that and running the ball more, as the Bills have said for years they want to do, and it seems like there was kind of a rift between Dable and McDermott, if they're running the ball more, if they're running more 12 personnel, how does that lend itself to additional reps and targets for wide receivers? So you've got Diggs and Davis locked in as your number 1 and 2 outside guys. And then in the slot for 1 year, you'll have Jamison Crowder. That'll be good. McKenzie's there as well to share split time in the slot, and he'll be here for 2 years. And then also as a viable roster candidate, you have Jake Kumaro. He's going to be like kind of the last receiver on the roster type of player, kind of like a 6th wide receiver, special teams guy, things like that. So I don't think that you can count on anything from Marquez Stevenson. He didn't show much. He was shaky and didn't look great on return duty even in his rookie year. And keep in mind, he was a late round pick in a weak draft class that was limited by COVID. So I don't really look for much to be made of Marquez Stevenson. So that leaves you, teams usually roster 6 or 7 wide receivers. So I named 5 that are pretty much roster locks. So I think what the team needs is kind of like a field stretching number 3 outside guy. To kind of spell Diggs and Davis or fill in an event of injury or really play in rare 4 wide sets. So I could see that happening, but I just don't know if you're using a wide receiver, if you're getting a wide receiver for your top pick, what are you doing? Where is he playing? You're not moving Diggs or Davis for sure. I can see doing a backup slot too, like someone to replace Jamison Crowder next year, since Isaiah McKenzie isn't really seen as a true slot, probably more of a gadget guy. So I could see the Bills adding up to 2 wide receivers. If they were to do that, I'd probably say maybe like a 2nd rounder and a 4th rounder, because there's a lot of good depth in the class. But I think after the 4th round, it probably gets to where, you're probably talking about guys that aren't going to make the roster. Tight end. This is a really interesting one because all 3 of your tight ends are on expiring contracts. But your top 2 tight ends are really good tight ends. So if you draft someone high, what are you doing? Again, they're not going to play because you have Dawson Knox, O.J. Howard. Hopefully you're going to extend Knox. He's definitely an extension candidate, and hopefully that comes soon. If you bring a tight end in, he's probably like a tight end 3 and pushing Tommy Sweeney down to the practice squad. But keep in mind, the Bills only rostered 2 tight ends for a good portion of the year last year. So I think, though, if Dorsey is going to incorporate more tight end usage, it would make sense to bring in another tight end as a developmental prospect, because O.J. Howard's here in a Mitch Trubisky type of situation. He's here to resurrect his career and move on. So he's not going to be here next year. Dawson Knox hopefully will be, and then you could maybe theoretically draft a guy to be your number 2 along with Knox next year. So I look for that, possibly like a 3rd or 4th round type of pick, maybe like an Isaiah Likely. Could be a great pick there. Offensive line. This is a sore spot for me because mock after mock, commentary after commentary, social media, it's IOL, IOL, IOL. We need an IOL. Explain to me why we need an interior offensive lineman. Let's just look overall. Teams roster 9, maximum 10 offensive linemen, usually 9. The Bills' starting 5 is locked in. Dawkins, Saffold, Morse, Bates, Spencer Brown. Backups. At tackle, you have Tommy Doyle, you have David Questenberry. Okay. Interior backups, Cody Ford and Ike Butker. Are you going to cut Cody Ford or Ike Butker? I know the fans are down on Cody Ford, but I don't think the Bills have given up on him, just like Zach Moss. This is a high draft pick. They've said over and over again they still believe in him. They've shown. They've given him chances. He was not as terrible as fans want to make him out to be last year. And as a depth piece, a backup option, he's got tons of starting experience. So does Ike Butker. And then you have Greg Mance also with tons of starting experience as maybe your 10th offensive lineman or practice squad guy as a backup center. So, frankly, I don't get it. You have people saying we should use the 25th pick on a guard. The 25th pick, if you spend a 25th pick on a guard, he's going to be expected to come in and start. There is not a starting position open on the team. So I can see a late round developmental guard, maybe stash him on the practice squad, but you tried that with Jack Anderson last year, and the Giants swooped in and took him when you cut him at the end of training camp. You didn't even get to put him on the practice squad. So the same thing is going to happen this year. So I don't get the IOL thing. I think that guard is clearly a non-premium position. You don't need to plan years in advance for what you're going to do. I know Saffold is on a 1-year deal, but we can deal with that next year. Guard can be a need next year, and that's fine. It's just simply not a need this year. You've got adequate depth. You've got a really nice looking starting 5. Let's move on and focus on another area that has a more substantial need. Just a moment. All right, so specialists. Kicker, obviously the Bills are set with Bass. Long snapper, Reed Ferguson, we're good. Punter, big need. People don't talk about it a whole lot, but Matt Hawk was the worst punter statistically in the National Football League last year. Bills need a new punter. It should not be hard to get one. All you have to do is use one of your 6th-round picks on the best punter in the draft. I think that's Jordan Stout, Penn State. If you look at the advanced stats, he's better than Matt Araiza, the punt god. And I think that with the Penn State connection with the Pagulas, it makes a lot of sense. And I would be shocked if the Bills don't use... Well, if the draft falls in such a way that no one takes a punter, I could see the Bills just bringing in a punter as an undrafted free agent. But I would expect the Bills to recognize the need enough that they do use one of those late-round picks that probably wouldn't make the roster at any other position. Just go ahead and use that on a punter. The Bills do need an answer at kickoff return and punt return. Stevenson was pretty bad, frankly, last year, and McKenzie showed, more ball security issues again. You just don't trust him back there. Micah Hyde's a great option if you want someone safe just to catch the ball on punt return, but you really want something more dynamic. The Bills really missed like an Andre Roberts last year. So hopefully one of the receivers, if they draft a receiver or two, one of them can be your new return guy, or a corner. If they draft a corner or two, maybe they can get someone with some return ability. So defensive line, the Bills are 100% set at edge. I mean, you've got obviously Von Miller, Greg Rousseau, there are your starters. And, for backups, you've got Epinesa, Basham, and Shaq Lawson. So the cupboard is 100% full. There is no way to cram anyone else in there. If there's one position on the team that wouldn't make any sense to draft a player at, it's defensive end. Unless you're, packaging someone else and you're moving up to draft one or something like that. So now interior defensive line, I think, is sneaky. I think there's an opportunity for the Bills to potentially make this an awkward training camp battle. Because you have, obviously, Oliver, you signed Daquan Jones, you signed Tim Settle. You expect all three of those guys to be there. Jordan Phillips was brought in on a one-year deal. And the fans are excited about that. Phillips is excited about that. But he's coming off an injury. He didn't get a big deal. It's pretty much a veteran minimum type of thing. And so I wouldn't be shocked to see competition. Because they only go 4 deep, really. So even though they probably roster only 4, it wouldn't be shocking to me if you do see them bring in a rookie at some point to kind of compete with Jordan Phillips and see, see who the best man is. Because long term, you're going to need something else there along with Ed Oliver. And I just don't know. You don't know for sure how the Daquan Jones, Tim Settle signings are going to work out. So no one's talking about IDL. I wouldn't be shocked to see an addition there at some point, even early, if that's how the board falls. It would be disappointing because it's not a high-impact early contributor. But again, that's not how Bean looks at it. Bean's looking at the future. So, linebacker. The only way you're going to add a linebacker, I think, in this draft is if you are thinking that you're not going to extend Tremaine Edmunds. So nobody knows for sure what's going to happen with Edmunds. People want to trade him. People want to cut him. People want to keep him. He's the most polarizing player I can ever remember on the Bills. So I think, reading everything they've said, all the signs, it seems like they love him in the building. So obviously you'd love to see him make more big plays. You'd love to see him have a bit more nasty to his game. But they seem to love him. I think they'll try to bring him back on a long-term deal if they can afford, make the money work. But we'll see. So if they choose to bring Edmunds back, your depth, obviously Edmunds, Milano, Dotson is a great backup for both positions. You also signed Markel Lee, who's a proven NFL player, started all of last year for Las Vegas. And then also as depth, you have Andre Smith. He's looked good in spot duty. He's a great special teams player. Tyler Matakevich, he's a special teams captain, and has looked good at linebacker as well. So I think you're looking really good at linebacker unless you're planning to unload Tremaine Edmunds. So wouldn't shock me to see something like that happen, but that would be one of the more surprising routes that Bean could take, I think. Corner. So if there's one area on the Bills roster that seems to be a glaring need, it's certainly cornerback. Now, we've said this before in previous years when it wasn't as dire as it is now, and the Bills did nothing. Now, having said that, all the signs, everything Bean has said, everything McDermott has said, point to them doing nothing again. Now, they could be smoke screening. I hope so. But McDermott, even if you go back to his Carolina days, always has a number one corner and then just a guy who gets you through the game, gets you through the season. And McDermott schemes it up. He coaches them up. And I almost want to say it's a point of pride for Sean McDermott that he handles the cornerbacks and he'll make it work with whatever he's got. So, I don't know. Trey White's obviously coming off the ACL. They seem to think he's doing really well in his recovery. It seems like maybe he's ahead of schedule. So if he is ahead of schedule and will be ready for the opener, that kind of changes it a little bit because you at least have, you can say White and Jackson are your starters, which is, fine, not great, but fine. But McDermott, on the other hand, did say, they have to be careful with what they are expecting from White, in year one back off the injury. So, it's interesting. It's very interesting. I think the number one position that most fans want to see the Bills address in the first round is corner. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So right now, let's say Trey White is not back for the beginning of the season. Your nickel looks great. You've got Taron Johnson, you've got Saran Neal, and by the way, Saran Neal signed that big deal that was bigger than expected, and they did say that they're hoping to get him more opportunities on defense. So if they do that, I don't know what that really entails. He doesn't have the ability to play outside. I don't know. But so you've got Johnson, Neal, and Cam Lewis, who's a player that, has bounced up and down between the roster and the practice squad for a few years now, who they really like. So nickel is fine. Nickel's set. We're good. But for boundary corners, without Trey White, you're looking at Dane Jackson and Dane Jackson. And so with White, you're looking at White and Dane Jackson. And then you have Nick McLeod, but this is a practice squad player. So is Elijah Griffin. These are practice squad players. That's all you have. Now, Nick McLeod was a guy you liked last year in training camp. He flashed. You cut him. He went to Cleveland, played a little bit, came back at the end of the year in the practice squad. So maybe they see something they like there and feel like they can mold. But how can you go into a season with Dane Jackson and a practice squad player who's never played a down for you penciled in as your starting cornerbacks with nothing in depth? So something clearly needs to be done. Maybe they'll bring in a veteran after the draft. Who knows? But hopefully we'll see cornerback drafted early. If not, we'll just have to hope that McDermott can pull the rabbit out of his hat again with that position group. But he's definitely making a more dangerous play now than he ever has in the past. Even though it seems every year when they cut to 53, every single year, I'm like, why are we going so thin at corner? What's going on? We're the thinnest team in the whole league at corner. It just seems to be a thing with McDermott for whatever reason. Now, safety is kind of like linebacker. The safety position is really good from a depth perspective because behind Poyer and Hyde, you have Damar Hamlin, who's a good-looking rookie a year ago, so he's got a few years left on his deal. Jaquan Johnson has 1 year left on his deal. He's looked good in reserve. And then you have Josh Thomas on the practice squad as well, who really flashed in training camp last year, and they really like him. So I think the depth is great. The only question is the Poyer contract dispute. If the Poyer contract dispute is a non-issue and you're going to sign him, then I wouldn't expect to see any action at safety. But if they draft one, that could signal, especially if they draft one high, that could signal that Poyer could be on the move. So it will be interesting to see what happens with that. So looking through all of the position groups as we did, it really seems like, there are a few positions where you could maybe envision a player being added. I would say that's running back, interior defensive line, linebacker if you're going to move on from Edmonds, safety if you're going to move on from Poyer. But then the positions where there really seem to be opportunities to plug holes and to improve the roster substantially are simply three positions: wide receiver, maybe two of them, corner, maybe two of those, boundary corners, and then punter. So it'll be super interesting to see how the draft falls. It'll be super exciting. Bills have 8 picks, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 2 6th, and a 7th. I can't wait, and I hope you're excited too.